Hey there, coders. Today we're going to be looking at for in loops. So let's do it. All right, so today we're going to be taking a look at the for in loop. And we looked at while loops and for loops before, but for loops are a little bit different. They're designed specifically to work with objects inside of JavaScript. So their functionality is a little bit different. Their setup is a little bit different. Let's go ahead and take a look. So the first thing we're going to do is create an object. So let's say just const object1 is equal to, give it some properties. We'll say name is Luke. Age is, give it a value, let's say 25. Occupation, say fighter pilot. Say, let's do with call sign. Red 5. All right. So we have an object1 or obj1, depending on how you want to go with that. We have a name, age, occupation, and call sign properties. And our goal here, let's say, would be to log out each of these properties to the console. So there's, of course, a couple of ways that we could do that. We could say console.log obj1, say that name, right? And then that would give us the name. We could say console.log obj1 dot age, and that will give us the age, and so on and so forth. So we could do multiple console log statements if we wanted to log all those values out. And if we go ahead and open that, at least we can see the first couple. So we inspect that. Go to the console. So Luke and 25. All right. So we console logged out a few of the values. But what if we want to get to all of the values that are inside of the object? And not necessarily to console log them, but what if we need access to them for some reason? Or we just want to go through and find out what properties exist. So the way that we can do that is by using a for in loop. So we've looked at for loops before. A for in loop, a little bit, I say much simpler from a syntax perspective, but a little bit more complicated potentially from a conceptual perspective. So let's check it out. So a for in loop does start like a for loop, where we have a for keyword or for statement and then an expression to it. The difference is how we handle the expressions. Now, unlike, say, like a while loop or like a typical for loop that has 3 expressions, a typical for loop will have an initialization expression, a conditional expression, and a final expression. A for in loop only has 1 expression, and that's we could call it an in expression, but basically just has 1 expression. So the way that we set that up is that we can say const. We're going to give a variable name. In this case, we can use key because key value inside of an object. Property is also a common one because a property inside of an object. But the thing to remember here is that we're just declaring a variable. The name, whether we used key or property or fluffy bunnies or whatever we happen to use as the name for the variable, it's not super relevant. Although typically we would want to choose, like in most cases with variable names, we would want to choose a value that represents what it's storing. So we'll go ahead and use prop. Prop is I'm a fan of prop. So we can say const prop. We're defining a variable. And then in is the next keyword. And then we want to say the object that we want to loop through. In this case, that's obj1. All right. So for const prop in obj1, and then we create our code block, because remember, loop, we have whatever the expression is, typically one that goes false. In this case, we're not looking for the same thing. This will just loop through every property inside of the object. So the way we set up this one again, for const prop, create a variable name in object. So the first thing that we should do here is we should console log what our variable is. So let's go ahead and console log prop. Let me put a label on it. And then just prop. All right. Let's go ahead and save that. then run the code and see what we get. All right, okay, here's our console. So now we can see here that we get name, age, occupation, and call sign. And if we go back to our code, we will see that those are all of the properties inside of the object. But this may seem a little confusing. Where are those properties come from? How are we getting access to them? Well, it's worth pointing out that this expression right here is what it's saying is store each property from this object into this variable for each iteration of the loop, one at a time. So it's going to start at the beginning of the object. It's going to start with the first property. In this case, name was the first property, and then age, occupation, and call sign. So these won't always be in that order, which is one of the interesting things about objects and why we can't loop through them like we would an array, where we could say object.length. Objects don't have a length. And they don't have indexes that are numerical like an array does. So it's difficult to loop through them, or you really can't loop through them using a typical for loop. So that's where this for in loop comes from. So what it's doing every time the loop iterates is it takes the next property in whatever object this object is, and it assigns it to the prop variable. That's not always prop. Again, it could be any variable, but in this case, it's the prop variable. Let's go to our sources so we can walk through it and actually take a look, because this usually helps out a lot. So let's go ahead and put our breakpoint on line 9. I'm going to refresh the page. Of course, that's where it stops. So now we're inside of our for in loop. If we highlight prop, notice the value, its name. So when this started, the first thing that happened is it took a property from the object1 object and it assigned it to this prop variable. So we can see that. And also down here, we can have all of our information currently as far as block scoping goes. So what's involved in here, what variables are we dealing with is just the prop. So if we console log prop, then we'll notice that, let's go ahead and step forward one. We go to the console and then name comes out, right? That was our first property. If we go back to sources, we'll notice that if we highlight object1, that hasn't changed. If we highlight prop, usually unhighlighted does something. Let's go ahead and step to the next one. There we go. So if we highlight prop now, there it is, age. So notice that we don't see where this happens. It's just kind of something we have to accept with the for in loop, is that it's going to go through the properties one at a time. So the next iteration, prop is now age. It's going to log that to the console. It's going to go back up here. Prop is not, hasn't been assigned. There it is, value unavailable. That's why I highlighted it doesn't work. So the value hasn't been assigned yet. So we haven't assigned whatever the next property is yet. If we step forward again, we'll see now it's occupation. So if we go back to our console, we'll see our previous ones, name and age. And then we're now prop has moved on to occupation. We step forward again, currently unavailable, move to the next iteration of the loop, and now it's call sign. So if we go to our console log, we have our 3 console logs so far. We step forward again. This value is unavailable. And then notice there was no value for it. So there were no properties in the object for it to loop through. So once it reaches the end, it just stops and then doesn't go anymore. So we don't have to have a conditional expression with a for in loop that says like, this is when the loop should stop running. The loop automatically knows when to stop running because it gets to the end of the properties for an object. So it will not run anymore. All right, so that can be kind of helpful as we can get to all of the properties, right? If we look at a console, we get all of the properties out, but what if we want to access the values inside of the object rather than the properties? So what we can do is take advantage of the fact that we have our object and we have the property names. Because if we want to access a property in an object, let's go back to our code real quick. We did that originally with our console logs, right? Like we had console.log, let's say object1.name. And if we run that code, just go ahead and step through. When we go to the console, oh, hold on. I'll keep going until it hits the breakpoint. There we go. So we go to the console now. So we get all of our props, all of the variable values or the property values from our for in loop, and then our name down here is Luke. That was the last thing that we did. Now, remember that we can use bracket notation if we need to substitute a variable value when accessing an object property, right? So we're using .name here, and that works because we want to get access to it. But what if we wanted to get object one at prop? Now we can try that where we go obj.prop. Let's go ahead and get rid of that console log. So we would think it's like, okay, well, if the property variable is representing the properties inside of the object, maybe we can use dot notation to access it. So let's go ahead back here to the console. Oh, object is not defined. Oh, helps to have one. Always good to check those errors. Let's go ahead and open that up again. Okay, so notice it did get 4 console logs, but they were all undefined. And the reason for that is that dot notation can only be used when you have these literal property names. So if I did object one dot name, of course, we should get 4 console logs that have the name. There we go. Or if I did dot age, then we should get the age 4 times. But that's not helping us here because what we want to do is to be able to loop through each property and access those values. So what we have to do is make use of bracket notation. So bracket notation will allow us to substitute a variable value in order to access an object. So if we put prop in here, then we'll notice, let's go to sources. If we go to console, that we have all of our property values come out. So Luke 25, fighter pilot, and red 5, which are all the values. And that's because as it's looping, it's saying, okay, object one at whatever the property name is, which is stored in this variable. And then we can access it using that. So bracket notation will allow you to substitute variable values to access object properties. And that's perfect when we're doing a for in loop like that, if we want to get access to each of our properties. We should go to sources and take a look at it so we can kind of visualize it. So let's go ahead and put the breakpoint here. So we refresh. The first thing we're going to do is define our object. And then we get down to our for in loop. If we highlight object one, that's going to be our object. So this is the object we'll be looping through. Prop doesn't currently have a value. So if we move forward, it gets assigned. Prop is now name. So prop is name. Object one has a name property. If we highlight the whole expression, we get Luke, because object one at name would represent the value Luke. So notice again, our bracket notation allows us to substitute our variable value, and then we can use it to access each of the properties in turn. If we continue to step forward, notice the prop once again becomes unavailable, then it gets a value. So prop is now age. So object one at age is 25, right? Because object one at age is 25. We can highlight them individually, but together we'll always give you what the actual expression represents, which in this case is 25. We can continue to step through that. Prop will get changed to occupation. What is object one at occupation? That is fighter pilot. And then finally, call sign. We highlight that. Object one at call sign is red 5. All right. No more properties to iterate through, and thus the loop ends. So the for in loop, again, is probably the simplest of loops. From creating a perspective, it's basically just the for statement and then the expression, which creates the variable and names the object that you'll be looping through. But conceptually, this one is often very confusing for people in the beginning because they don't get to see where it's actually set up. Like in a for loop where you can see, okay, it's starting at 0 index, it's going to loop through up until the length of the array -1. And then after each iteration, we're going to increase the value of the index variable, so it'll eventually become false and the conditional expression in the loop will end. Again, we don't have a conditional expression all we have is an expression stating what name we want to use for our variable to access the properties in the object or the keys, and then the name of the object that we want to loop through. So sometimes a bit of an abstraction like this can make it more confusing because you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but hopefully this has given a little bit of information. Now, one more thing that we do want to touch on is an array, because we said that these for in loops were designed for objects, right? So let's create an array real quick, and we'll set that equal to, just put a few numbers in it, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we have an array of 5. Now, if I put array here, and we're just going to console log, let's say, array at, let's just console log prop. All right, so we're going to console log property, so whatever the value is here, and then that's our array. So it's set up now, and notice array is after the in keyword, so this is the structure that we're planning to loop through. Now, if we go back to our code and refresh it, go ahead and turn off the breakpoint so we can just see the console logs. And notice that what we get for the property values are 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we'll notice that 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is the keys for that, right? Because an index is basically an object that has numeric properties. So when I started, I said that objects or for in loops should be only used for objects. And we notice here that we can use them for an array. But they're not designed to do that, which is why we typically don't use them for that purpose. And I say typically is we really don't use them for that purpose. For in loops should only be used for objects. And that's because they're a structure specifically designed to work with objects. Because JavaScript arrays are actually objects under the hood in JavaScript, we can use them for arrays, but again, we should not use them for arrays. Just a good thing to keep in mind. You may see some examples where people do that. And again, I wouldn't say that it's categorically wrong, but it's kind of like using a screwdriver to put a nail in. If you beat the end of the nail with the screwdriver, you can probably get it into whatever you're trying to sink the nail into, but you should use a hammer instead. And programming has a lot of stuff like that. There's so many ways to do things, but we typically want to only use tools that are designed for the specific purpose that we're trying to achieve. And that's it for in loops. So make sure to have some fun with these. Make sure to take advantage of the dev tools and going through your sources and kind of walking through it so you can see how it's working. They will become a lot more clear with time. So have fun with your for in loops, and we'll talk to you later.